right? I'm already starting to get to those points. I'm sure you guys probably are too as well, where you're having meetings and discussions where a lot of people are saying, well, let's just wait until after the holidays to make that decision, right? Let's just wait until the following year. Let's wait till next year before we start working on that. Like, this starts to become the time of year where schedules and calendars get packed like that, and people are having to readjust and just saying, you know what, why don't we just kick this can down the road a little bit? And I can definitely see that being the case. And so one of the advantages to you purchasing during the winter is that you will Welcome to the Home Goals Podcast, the ultimate guide for turning your home goals into a reality. I'm your host, Derek Thornton. Join us as we navigate the twists and turns of obtaining a home. We'll be offering expert tips, helping you avoid pitfalls, and championing your journey towards that cherished place to call home. In this week's episode, we will be answering or kind of talking about the question that often comes up in many of my conversations with buyers, and that is it a good idea for me to buy a house in the winter? You know, when you look at the average real estate sales and you look at the models and things that kind of predict what's going on or what's happening in the marketplace, in most cases, when you look at the overall sales that are taking place during the course of a year, in the wintertime and stuff, as well as it comes into the beginning of the year, you start to see sales, overall sales at their lowest, right? The lowest amount of transactions are often happening around that December, January timeline, right? And as you look at it, it slowly starts to creep up until it usually in a normal year will peak around late spring, early summer, and then slowly start to decline until it gets right back down until the winter months in December again, whatever. So most people would look at that and think to themselves, okay, well, that's when the most activity is happening in the market. That must be the best time for me to purchase a home, and kind of go based off of that. You should never look at what the masses are doing anytime you're making a decision, especially a decision this important, right? When you're going to purchase a home, you don't need to be focused on what everybody else is doing or what is working necessarily for everyone else. You need to focus on what is always best for your situation. And so any period of time, right? If you look at any point in the calendar, any season that you purchase a home in, there will always, I'm going to say that again, there will always be some type of advantage and some disadvantages to purchasing a home, right? There is no quote unquote perfect time for you to purchase a home. There's always going to be some advantages and disadvantages you have to keep in mind. And there are some things that can happen that could benefit you greatly during the wintertime, and there's some other things that may not. It's always going to be based on your particular situation. And so even though you know that all of your friends and family and everybody else may be flocking to the springtime, that doesn't always necessarily mean that that's going to be the best time for you as well. And so you really want to take a second to really think through a lot of these things we're going to talk about, ask yourself these questions, and figure out what works best for your situation. And so we're going to get into kind of the nuts and bolts of this decision and some of the things that I have noticed through the years and some things that I've kept in mind. Because again, this is a question that always inevitably comes up, is that, hey, like, we have our ducks in a row, we have everything ready to go, but we don't really know if the winter time is the best time for us to purchase a home. What do you think, Derek? And so I'm going to talk to you and tell you some of the same things that I tell my buyer clients when we're having these discussions to help them feel a little bit better or feel more comfortable with making whatever decision that they decide to make. And so first, we're going to talk about some of the advantages to buying during the winter time. The winter time is definitely, like I said, it's usually getting around that fourth quarter, the end of the year. It's starting to get dark early. We got daylight savings time coming up soon. And so it's a lot of the focus tends to shift into the following year, right? I'm already starting to get to those points. I'm sure you guys probably are too as well, where you're having meetings and discussions where a lot of people are saying, well, let's just wait until after the holidays to make that decision, right? Let's just wait until the following year. Let's wait till next year before we start working on that. Like, this starts to become the time of year where schedules and calendars get packed like that, and people are having to readjust and just saying, you know what, why don't we just kick this can down the road a little bit? And I can definitely see that being the case. And so one of the advantages to you purchasing during the winter is that you will have fewer buyers competing with you for the inventory that is on the market. Whether you realize it or not, when you first enter the market as a home buyer, you are going to be in competition with other people, right? You're going to be in competition with other buyers out there and other sellers. Even if you purchase a home that no one else made an offer on, there are still other buyers out there that had to say no to that home in order for you to have an opportunity at it, right? And so again, there's always buyers in the market. I don't care how grim it may look, how houses may be moving slowly. I don't care how long something may have been sitting on the market. There's always buyers out there. It's just a matter of whether or not they've decided that that particular home is exactly what they want in that situation. So you're always going to be competing with some buyers out there. There's no time of year, no situation where I could say, hey, guaranteed 100%, there's no other potential buyers out there for this house that you're interested in, right? And so if you purchase during the winter, you have less chance of having to compete for that house. Because a lot of times when you're competing for a home, you have no idea what that other person is offering. You have no idea what their financial situation is. Maybe they are paying cash and they can afford to put a little bit more up front. Maybe they're more appealing to the sellers and what they can offer in terms of the loan type and all those things. There's a lot of factors that go into it. And it's not always necessarily just the price. Right. Like I said, the price is often the most important factor that comes into play when you're trying to purchase a home, when you're submitting an offer. But there's a lot of other things that come into play too, right? What is your timeline like? How quickly can you make that deal happen? Are you having a finance or a loan type that has a bunch of hoops that the seller's going to have to jump through to make this deal work, right? There might be other buyers who are more appealing to them. All these things are taken into consideration, right? And so if you have a loan type that might be a little more difficult, right? There might be some more red tape and things that you have to go through to get that loan to close. Ideally, the wintertime might work better for you because, again, if you have less buyers, that means that seller can't be as choosy or as picky with the terms that your loan is requiring you to have to go through, right? And so all of these things are need to be taken into consideration, but fewer buyers means fewer competition or lower competition, and you have a chance of getting the house that you want, right? And so where I might be writing maybe 4 or 5 offers or something before somebody finally lands the house they want, in wintertime, that number might get dropped down to 1 or 2 houses, right? And so you're being able to find the house that you want faster and with less competition. And with less competition too, there's usually less variables where you're not having to say, okay, what happens if we make offers on all these different houses and nothing comes to it? Are we going to extend our lease? What are we going to do? Are we going to stay where we are, stand pat? What's going to happen? You have a little bit more data to go off of if you know you have less competition coming into the marketplace. The next advantage to purchasing during the winter is that the sellers who are selling during the winter time tend to be, not always, but more often than not, they tend to be more motivated than your average seller. Selling a home is an incredibly stressful and just downright annoying process, right? There's nothing fun about selling your home. You may enjoy getting the check at the closing table, but outside of that, everything else, the showings, packing up boxes, all that stuff, nobody enjoys the moving process. Nobody enjoys the selling process. The only reason that people go through it or put themselves through that is because they have the promise or the hope of the house that they're moving to, right? That's what gives them the motivation and kind of the feeling that they can make it through this or push through whatever hassle they're having to go through with selling the house. But no one enjoys selling a house, right? And so when you have an experience like that, or you have something like that that's coming down the pipe and you know you have to do it, it's a good chance that you're not going to want to do that during the holiday season, right? Like I said, I was mentioning earlier, we already have a lot of things going on during this time of year. Do you really want to add the stress of moving on top of all of that, right? The stress of getting out of your home in time for showings, the stress of having to go through all these other ancillary details and stuff like that, and having your home show ready and paying for vendors to come in and fix and touch up things. Do you really want to go through that during the wintertime? More times than not, the answer is going to be no. for a seller, especially during the holidays. And so right out of the gate, if someone is selling their home during the wintertime, it's because they need to. It's not necessarily because they just want to put their house on the market and just kind of test it and see how things are going. No, if someone's selling in the winter, more often than not, it's because they have already bought something and they like, hey, I need to sell this house because I've already purchased the one that I want, or it's a job relocation or something else that is causing them to want to move. It's very rare that you run into people who just want to see how the market's doing and go, oh, I'll put my house on there, see how it performs. And if it doesn't sell, we can just pull it back off. Those are the type of sellers that you typically see more often during the springtime, right? People who want to sell but don't necessarily need to sell. And as I've said before in past podcast episodes, you cannot underestimate how big of a deal motivation is when it comes to any transaction. And that's for all sides involved, right? Again, the fun part of buying a house from a buyer's perspective is just looking at the homes and being able to close. Fun part for the sellers being able to collect that check from the closing with whatever proceeds they got from it. Hopefully they did get proceeds. But everything in between that is a hassle. It's annoying. It's a tedious process that no one really wants to go through. And so that motivation is going to be the thing that kicks in and gives both sides, the buyer and the seller, the added energy to press through all those other tedious things that they don't want to have to deal with. And so you really want a motivated seller. The worst thing you want to deal with is having someone who just sort of kind of wants to sell their home, because more often than not, they're usually going to make things difficult for you. That transaction is going to have likely some problems that happen. And if they're not motivated to sell, they're not going to be working with you to kind of help this deal get to the closing table. What helps the majority of real estate transactions reach closing is because most of the time, both sides have the same goal in mind: to get that house sold, right? The buyer wants to get that house sold so that they can take ownership. The seller wants to get it sold so they can move on to the next thing. They have that common goal in mind. If both sides start out and they don't have that same common goal, it's going to lead to some other issues or problems down the road. And so you always want to work with someone who is motivated to sell that house, and your chances of finding someone like that are significantly higher if you purchase during the winter. And then another item that a lot of people actually forget about or don't even really consider when they purchase during the winter is that because there are less transactions and deals going on, that means that all of the other vendors that are typically associated with a real estate transaction, right? The movers, the plumbers, the contractors, like all these different people that tend to have some role that they play in a real estate transaction, they aren't typically as busy during the wintertime because, again, there are less transactions and less deals going on. And so you have your pick a little bit more so than you would in the springtime, right? If you wait until the spring when everybody else is buying, you might have to hire a mover before you even have a house under contract, right? Like they're booked up 4 or 5 weeks out, or the ones that you want anyway, right? There's all these other services and things that you would love to use and have your pick of the litter, but you may be competing with all the other buyers for those same vendors and for those same dates and times and everything else. And so if you buy during a less popular time, you will have less people vying for those vendors out there, and you get to pick who you want to actually handle the deal. And so that's one thing that a lot of people tend to forget about, but can make your life a lot easier and a lot simpler, because you can kind of have your pick and do it based on your own timeline that works best for you. So those are some of the major advantages to purchasing to the winter. I also want to take some time to go through some of the disadvantages and make sure we kind of tackle or address some of those as well. One of which, and the biggest one, the most glaring one, is that there's going to be limited inventory, right? So again, if there's less transactions and less deals happening, if less sellers are willing to put their home on the market during this time of year, then that means that you as a buyer have less inventory that you can choose from, right? Like I said, we often run into this a lot of times as well, where someone is going through the process of looking at houses and they put in their criteria and they're just not seeing much of anything that really matches what they're looking for, right? They'll put in all the searches, those set up showings, and they're just like, this doesn't really fit with what I want, what I'm looking for in a house. And so as far as this particular point goes, usually when I'm working with a buyer and they're considering whether or not they want to buy during the wintertime, one of the main things that I'll take them to take into consideration is the type of house that you were looking for. How rare is it in that market? Right. If it's something that is constantly coming on the market, that's constantly available, it might be a better time for you to search during the winter because you know that you have something that is pretty common. If you're looking for something that is extremely rare, right, or it's unique in some way, right, maybe you need a specific style. Maybe it has to be a ranch style. It has to have room for horses. It has to be a certain acreage. It has to be all these different things. If you have all these different criteria that you need to have for that house, the wintertime usually isn't going to be a good time for you because there's less inventory to choose from and there's not a lot of stipulations, right? The people, like your highest likelihood of being able to find a house like that is usually going to be during the spring, right? And so if someone is ever coming to me with criteria that I know are very specific and they're not going to be a ton of houses that match what they're looking for, it might be better for you. Even though you might have more competition and more people out there, the springtime is usually going to be better if you have something that isn't a common find in that marketplace. And as we always say, real estate is hyper local, right? And so whatever is quote unquote common for your area is going to be dependent on where you're looking. And that's where your realtor is really going to come into play because they can help you determine whether or not what you're looking for is common in that area or whether or not it's something that you may need to pull the trigger on now because something like that is likely to hit the market or come available. Another thing, and this is kind of in relation to the first point too, but another thing that some people may not consider is that there's fewer open houses, right? And so if you're the type where you like to kind of go out on your own and look at different properties and look at things that are available and stuff like that, you will have fewer opportunities to do that because there's just simply less inventory, which means that there's less open houses, less opportunities for you to be able to see a lot of the inventory in the market. Now, if you're using your realtor, you can always set up an appointment with them. But if you're the type that likes to kind of get a view of things yourself or kind of take a look beforehand before you get in that process, it's going to be a little more difficult for you to do that during the wintertime. And then lastly, another disadvantage to it is that it's also, again, during the holidays. And all of those things that I talked about from the seller's perspective, right, where you're having to go through all of these tedious things that you really don't want to deal with or adding stress onto this time of year, that also applies to the buyer as well, right? The buyer is having to move from wherever they were currently living. They're having to go through the mortgage loan process during the holiday season, right? You're doing this massive purchase during a time of year when you're typically spending a lot of money on decorations and gifts and all these other things like that. And so you have to ask yourself if you're willing to make that sacrifice to have a holiday season that is a little bit all over the place, right? Where you might be unpacking moving boxes. You may not be able to get that Christmas tree up in time or get that holiday Thanksgiving dinner prepared in just the way that you wanted it to or have people over. You may not be able to do a lot of those things this holiday season because you're in the midst of moving. But it is something that you want to keep in mind. The other thing too, and this actually, I should have gone back, but let me add this as both a pro and a potential con as well. But the one advantage that we didn't reference is also the tax benefit that you would get to being able to purchase that home if you did it during the wintertime, right? So if you did it during the wintertime, there's tax advantages that you get when purchasing a home, right? There's things that are tax write-offs that you can use to help lessen your tax liability every year. And if you buy before year end, you can write off those the expenses that you spend on the house. You can write some of those things off to help lessen your tax bill in the spring. So that's one of the huge advantages. One of the disadvantages, though, is that there have been many times that I've seen in the past where people will use a tax refund to help them in their home purchase, right? And so they may say, hey, I know I'm going to get back a certain amount or whatever, or I'm likely to get back a certain amount from my taxes, and I can use that towards closing costs. I can use it towards moving expenses, a down payment. You can pick and choose how you want to use that, and you wouldn't have access to that if you bought during the winter time, right? And so again, it's it's an advantage, but it's also an disadvantage, just depending on what your tax situation or setup looks like. And you always want to talk to your accountant to figure out what may be best for you, and if that is going to be a factor that could change your decision or change your mind. But more than anything else we've talked about today, I hope that you would take away the fact that it all depends. Right. So anytime someone asks me this question, I don't have a blanket answer that I give to every single person. Like I said, it could change based on your situation, based on the loan type, based on the type of house that you're looking for, based on your tax situation. All these different factors can play a role in it. So I would never tell someone it's just blatantly not a good idea to buy during the winter. It could be the best time for you to buy depending on what your personal situation is, right? And so you want to talk to your realtor to see, like I said, what the market's doing, what houses are looking like, what inventory is looking like in your area. You want to talk to a lender, right, to see what the financial situation looks like, what type of loan you would need to use, what type of items on there. And you also want to talk to your accountant as well to see what the tax benefits or maybe disadvantages would be to purchasing now as opposed to waiting a little bit later. Though at a minimum, you want to talk to those people just to get a feel for whether or not the winter is the best time for you to purchase. But what I don't want you to do is just wait until spring simply because that's what everybody else is doing, right? You need to figure out what works best for you in your situation, and you're always going to be great. Don't focus on the rates and, well, maybe they'll drop or maybe they'll go up or maybe don't focus on those things. Like I said, we can figure out ways to help you to refinance or recast a rate or anything like that. Your personal situation, your financial situation, the loan type, all those different things should play a much bigger role than waiting on a rate. I've got plenty of horror stories to go around of people who waited and played the whole rate game where they'll wait to see, and I know rates are going to come down now. And then they waited and waited and waited and ultimately ended up getting priced out of the market, right? You don't want that to be your situation. And so focus on what works best for you. Let the market take care of itself, and you'll be as good to go as you can. And so I hope that that's helpful for you all. Again, I'm always happy to have that discussion to help you determine what works best for you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you next week.